Story 1. Dust and Discipline: How Victorian Librarians Fought Decay. You are walking slowly through a vast, dimly lit reading room. The echo of your footsteps is softened by heavy carpet, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the rustle of pages turned by unseen hands. The air is still, yet not entirely clean. Floating through the beams of gaslight, you can almost see it, a haze of dust. Fine, pale, endless dust. Welcome to a 19th-century library. Not a quaint one-shelf parlor nook, but a serious, civic institution, the type built with the weight of empire and intellect. These libraries were more than buildings. They were storehouses of human thought. And yet they were under siege. The enemy wasn't fire, flood, or vandalism. It was dust. The silent invasion. Dust in the 19th century was not merely an annoyance. It was a sign of decay. And in the minds of librarians, those unsung stewards of collective knowledge, it was a threat to civilization itself. Dust crept into bindings, dulled the gold leaf on spines, discolored paper, and invited mold. It held moisture when it shouldn't and dried out parchment when it needed humidity. More than this, it represented disorder in a world that prized cataloged knowledge. A dusty library was a neglected one. And a neglected library was, to many Victorians, an intellectual crime. At the British Museum Library, the precursor to today's British Library, the war on dust was relentless. In annual reports, the institution described with stern formality the many hours staff spent dusting shelves, inspecting bindings, and reorganizing the collections. There were discussions on the most effective cloths, wool versus cotton. The safest tools, feather dusters, were banned for dislodging too much debris, and the ideal rotation for shelf cleaning, bi-weekly, was too infrequent, daily too disruptive. What modern readers might call tedium was, for these librarians, a moral imperative. Librarians as soldiers of order. In the 19th century, librarians weren't merely keepers of books, they were guardians of public morals, historical memory, and civic virtue. The public library movement that gained momentum across Britain, France, and the United States was born out of Enlightenment ideals. A library was a civilizing tool, a space of discipline, study, and self-improvement. In such a temple of reason, dust was heresy. Consider Melville Dewey, the American library reformer who introduced the Dewey Decimal System. While famous for classification, Dewey was equally obsessed with cleanliness. He once proposed standard uniforms for librarians' pale-colored outfits that would show even the faintest speck of dust. He designed library buildings with narrow doorways and minimized furniture to reduce the accumulation of grime. He believed clean spaces nurtured clean minds. Even the act of borrowing a book was regulated. In some systems, patrons could not touch books directly. They would request a title at a desk, and a librarian gloved, meticulous would fetch it, inspect it, and pass it forward like a sacred object. Not because they feared theft, because they feared dust. The architecture of cleanliness. Architects, too, were enlisted into the war effort. The grand reading rooms of the 19th century, think of the round reading room at the British Museum, opened in 1857, were designed with airflow in mind. Clear-story windows, high ceilings, and controlled lighting aimed to limit the accumulation of dust and reduce humidity, which, in turn, slowed the decay of leather and paper. Some of the earliest examples of centralized air control were found not in hospitals, but in archives. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, rebuilt and expanded in the mid-1800s, boasted a revolutionary heating and ventilation system intended not for the comfort of readers, but for the preservation of volumes. Even the arrangement of shelves mattered. Books were kept away from exterior walls to avoid dampness. Shelves were built of metal, not wood, where possible, to reduce dust collection. Floors were laid with linoleum, a modern marvel, because it was easier to sweep. Every architectural decision whispered the same command: protect the books, protect them from time, from rot, and from dust. Cleaning as ceremony. The process of cleaning a library in the 19th century could rival a military operation. Teams of custodians, often young boys hired for pennies, were trained in careful, silent routines. They worked in pairs, one brushing, one inspecting. Every morning before the library opened, they combed through the shelves with horsehair brushes and oiled cloths. The dust collected was weighed, sometimes even logged, as a matter of bureaucratic pride. Some institutions required books to be removed one at a time, brushed at the edges, opened gently to release trapped particles, and returned in the exact position. This wasn't just cleanliness, it was ritual. One manual from the 1880s instructed staff to wear gloves, move only in clockwise patterns around each room, and avoid raising their arms too quickly lest the dust stirred be redistributed onto the higher shelves. It read more like choreography than custodial advice. Dust as a metaphor. Of course, dust was more than just a physical concern. In the age of moral crusades, it became symbolic. A dusty book was an unread book, a dusty corner, a space neglected. In pamphlets and speeches, reformers used dust as a metaphor for ignorance, decay, and even sin. Cleanliness and knowledge were intertwined. Dust represented not just physical deterioration, but societal decline. This logic extended beyond libraries. Museums, archives, even post offices embraced dust prevention with almost fanatical zeal. Clean spaces were modern, dirty ones were backwards. It's no accident that the library's image in this era was that of a cathedral, lofty, orderly, quiet. Dust broke the spell. Librarians versus the world. Despite their best efforts, 19th-century librarians were constantly outnumbered by the forces of decay. Coal-burning furnaces in cities like London and Manchester pumped soot into the air, which settled like black snow on every surface. Wet weather soaked the stone facades, and mold crept in. Industrialization made information explode: more books, more papers, more visitors, and every page, every breath, brought in more dust. Even as the tools improved, vacuum cleaners appeared near the century's end. The enemy adapted. New glues attracted insects, cheaper paper yellowed faster, and the patrons, noble as their intentions were, often forgot the rules. They opened windows, they brought in food, they sneezed. The librarians sighed, they redoubled their efforts. Some grew bitter. A report from 1887 includes a librarian's handwritten note in the margin: "Why bother? The dust will always return." And yet the work continued, day after day. Featherless dusters in hand, gloved fingers scanning for grit, these quiet custodians of culture waged a battle they knew they could not fully win. But what really were they fighting for? Was it only preservation? Or was dust, the finest, most forgettable of enemies, simply a symbol of something deeper? Of a world changing too quickly? Of knowledge always at risk of being lost to time? You step behind the great wooden desk, away from the reading tables where the public sits hunched under the hush of oil lamps. Here, beyond the public gaze, you find a narrow corridor lined with ledgers, cabinets of brass-labeled drawers, and long tables where the real work of the library unfolds. This is not a space of quiet contemplation, but one of constant, methodical effort. Here, in the dusty back halls of empire, the librarian labors not in grandeur, but in discipline. A profession without glamour. To the modern imagination, a librarian in the 19th century might seem a passive figure quietly shelving books or gently reminding readers not to talk. But in truth, the job demanded physical endurance, sharp memory, bureaucratic fluency, and above all, a dedication to invisible labor. In London's British Museum or the Boston Public Library, the working librarian began the day hours before patrons arrived. Boots scrubbed clean at the threshold, they entered buildings still chilly from the night, removed outerwear in tight cloakrooms, and proceeded to their assigned stations with military precision. They weren't just checking out books. They were updating vast catalogs by hand, inspecting deliveries of new material, often poorly packed and covered in dust or mold, and applying identification marks with India ink that stained fingers and cuffs, impossible to remove. Books arrived with pages uncut, bindings warped from ship voyages, or pages riddled with wormholes. Everything had to be assessed, measured, dried, restored, and catalogued, a process that could take weeks for a single volume. They worked by gaslight or, in less fortunate libraries, candlelight. The air was dry in winter, thick with coal soot in summer, and always there was dust. Classification, a ritual of control. Cataloging was the core of the profession, and no detail was too small. A librarian had to know whether a volume belonged under history, British monarchical early, or government legal statutes pre-common law, or if it was a pamphlet, perhaps ephemera, political reform acts. But these categories weren't fixed. Each library had its own system, sometimes based on author, sometimes subject, sometimes size, sometimes date of donation. Before Melville Dewey's decimal system gained wide acceptance, classification was an art form cloaked in tedium. And this tedium was taken seriously. In 1873, a librarian in Vienna wrote a 200-page internal memorandum debating the proper location for a series of anatomical drawings, not because of their artistic merit, but because they had once belonged to a scandalous nobleman. The question: should they be stored by subject or by provenance? Such was the weight placed upon order. Classification wasn't just organizational, it was philosophical. To place a book wrongly was to misrepresent truth. Human indexes. Before searchable databases or card catalogs were widespread, librarians themselves served as human indexes. A patron might approach and ask, "I'm looking for a volume on peat harvesting in East Prussia." The librarian, without checking a list, might pause and say, "Shelf 3B, north wing, third row from the bottom. It's bound in green cloth." Memory was prized above almost all else. The best librarians were walking catalogs, revered for their knowledge of not only content but location, condition, and lending history. They remembered the donor's handwriting on the title page of a folio. They knew that a certain atlas required careful handling because of its broken spine. They could predict which books would require cleaning again within the month, not from overuse, but from proximity to a leaky skylight. They were, in effect, archivists of entropy. Physical labor, invisible work. Library work wasn't gentle. Lifting folios, climbing ladders, dusting thousands of volumes, and hauling crates of periodicals took a toll. Women's access to the profession was limited until the late 19th century, partly due to assumptions about the physical nature of the job. In places like Manchester, Belfast, and Baltimore, some libraries hired laborers specifically for moving books and dusting, shelvers, and scrubbers, so that librarians could remain focused on intellectual work. But more often, the librarian did both. The burden was literal. A full shelf of 19th-century volumes could weigh hundreds of pounds, and ladders were steep, often unstable. Falls were not uncommon. A letter from a Glasgow library in 1869 describes a staff member bruised from shoulder to knee after slipping while dusting the top shelf of a map room. Few complained. Injuries, fatigue, even lung ailments from long exposure to dust or gaslight fumes were accepted risks, quiet sacrifices for a quiet profession. Dust and gender. As women entered the field in larger numbers by the 1880s and 90s, they were often assigned to cleaner tasks, the reading rooms, the children's sections, or catalog maintenance. But the dust, as always, found them. One library training manual for female assistants warned that skirts could stir dust when walking too briskly through the stacks. Another advised that women's long hair might trap soot, which then transfers to the bindings. Some institutions required women to tie their hair back and wear aprons, not to protect themselves, but to protect the books. There were also quiet rebellions. One young assistant in a Boston branch library wrote in her diary, They tell me not to touch the map drawers as they are too heavy, but I open them all the same, for they are covered in the most satisfying layer of dust. For many women, library work offered one of the few respectable professions available, and they took it seriously, dust and all. The slow death of books. Despite all this care, books continued to die, slowly, invisibly, inevitably. Bindings dried out and cracked. Paper turned brittle. Some ink began to eat through the very pages it marked. Bookworms not mythical but real burrowed into spines and laid eggs. Mold flourished in damp corners. Even fingerprints, full of oil and moisture, stained pages with invisible marks that grew over time. The more a book was loved, the more it decayed. Librarians bore witness to this decline. They mended torn pages with thin Japanese paper and starch paste. They resewed bindings using curved needles and linen thread. They stored vulnerable volumes in specially designed boxes, wrapped in cloth, labeled in longhand. And they watched, over years and decades, as the damage continued anyway. In this, the librarian's task was not to prevent death, only to slow it, to give knowledge a few more decades, perhaps another generation, perhaps long enough for some future librarian to find a better method. Bureaucracy and resentment. Not all librarians embraced their lot with quiet grace. As public libraries grew in number, so did their bureaucracy. Librarians were required to fill out endless reports, books repaired, hours spent dusting, visitor statistics, complaints handled. Monthly inspections by trustees meant closets were rearranged, record books rewritten, and dusting doubled the day before an official visit. In one library in Leeds, the chief librarian took to writing fictional dust logs. 3 hours spent cleaning the geological atlas shelf. He wrote for a shelf that had not been touched in months. He justified it as an act of resistance. If they will not fund proper help, they shall receive a proper fiction. Others simply quit. One note from 1893 reads, "Resigned after 12 years. The dust has entered my soul." Preservation versus access. Tension grew between those who saw libraries as museums of preservation and those who saw them as engines of education. Should the public be allowed to browse freely, even if they disorganized the shelves and introduced dirt? Or should books be kept behind counters, protected from idle hands? Some libraries installed glass cases for rare volumes. Others required gloves for all handling. But patrons often unfamiliar with the rules ignored the signs, bent spines, left books open, or marked passages in pencil. Librarians hovered, watched, sighed. Every stain on a page, every loose thread, was a tiny wound in their trust. But they also understood. A book unread was a book forgotten. The tension was never resolved. The psychological toll. Few spoke openly of the psychological toll of library work, but the signs were there. Notes in margins, increasingly bitter. Memos written in ink that trailed off mid-sentence. Journals found decades later, filled with lists of tasks undone, repairs unmade, books lost. One librarian, known only as E.B. in New York, left behind a series of letters written but never sent. In one, dated 1882, they wrote, "I dream often of falling paper, of shelves too high to reach, of rooms so full of dust that I cannot breathe, and yet when I wake I dress and go again." Librarians were not saints. They were workers, often overburdened and underpaid, who labored not for recognition, but for the illusion of order. And always, in the background, there was dust. The quiet erosion of materials, the weight of time, the sense that no matter how carefully they brushed and cataloged, decay would win. Still, they carried on. But what drove them? Why persist in a task that could never be completed? You are now standing before an old ledger. Its corners are rounded with wear, its cover faded to a muted brown. Inside, handwritten entries stretch in neat lines, names of borrowed volumes, dates of return, the occasional note, spine fraying or edges crumbling. The ink has faded, but the care remains visible, a record not just of books but of human vigilance. It is easy to forget that the most influential preservers of history were not the grand historians or celebrated authors, but the meticulous librarians who dusted, indexed, repaired, and protected the vessels of thought. Their daily tedium became our collective memory. The accidental heroes of history. In the public imagination, librarians rarely take center stage. They are cast as background figures, mild, quiet, unimportant. But within the quiet there was purpose. Without their intervention, entire collections and by extension, the understanding of whole eras would have been lost. Consider the 18th century pamphlets that fueled revolutions, or the obscure agricultural records that later revealed climate patterns, or the private correspondence of minor officials, once deemed forgettable, now central to understanding imperial policy. These survived not because of historians, but because librarians refused to discard them. They saw value in what others considered useless. They shelved the mundane with as much care as the monumental. And this, perhaps, was their truest contribution, the preservation of the boring. The boring as sacred. Victorian librarians made no apologies for their obsession with the mundane. They believed, often with a zeal unmatched by their literary contemporaries, that knowledge did not have to be grand to be important. An anonymous librarian from Bristol once wrote, "What some would throw away municipal notices, lists of toll increases, errata slips we keep, for these are the breadcrumbs of understanding. Future readers will know how a city functioned, not from its poems but its parking fines." This foresight shaped the very nature of archival preservation. Librarians across Europe and North America began developing ephemera files, collections of tickets, posters, laundry receipts, shop advertisements, and train schedules. None of it seemed important at the time, but in time, these collections became essential to understanding everyday life in the 19th century. They didn't chase glory, they chased accuracy. Institutional memory. What made the work of these librarians even more remarkable was their attention to continuity. They trained successors. They recorded not just what they did, but how and why they did it. Manuals, memos, and guidelines were written with an almost sacred devotion to future caretakers. In one Scottish archive, a 900-page staff manual survives, written entirely in longhand. It includes instructions for aligning books precisely, mixing archival paste, and adjusting gas lamps to avoid heat damage to the upper shelves. The final chapter ends with a line that reads, "If you find this work tedious, remember you are not serving today, you are serving tomorrow." They understood that libraries weren't just buildings, they were institutions of memory. If the institution forgot how to care for itself, knowledge would vanish quietly, like dust brushed from a shelf. Dust and preservation technology. Despite the archaic image, Victorian librarians were surprisingly adaptive. As technologies evolved, they embraced new tools in their battle against decay. Early vacuum systems were installed in larger libraries by the 1890s, not to clean floors, but to filter air and reduce airborne particulates. Innovations in bookbinding glue, leather dressing, and humidity control were tested, logged, and shared. In Paris, the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève maintained a decay ledger, a logbook in which every book showing signs of wear or infestation was documented, treated, and reviewed a year later. These records became an early model for preservation science. In many ways, the dust, this enemy they so feared, became the catalyst for innovation. Yet they knew every advance was temporary, every cloth tore, every adhesive aged. The dust would always return. The moral weight of maintenance. In a letter dated 1888, an Irish librarian named Daniel O'Farrell wrote, "I often feel my work lacks nobility. I do not write. I do not teach. I do not invent. I wipe the grime from 100 volumes a week and return them to their numbered places. But then I recall that history itself depends on the survival of such volumes, and that someone must stand between them and the slow corrosion of time. That someone is me. This quiet moralism ran deep. For librarians of the 19th century, maintenance was not just a task, it was a form of service. They saw themselves as humble stewards of something bigger than themselves: continuity. That continuity extended beyond books. Libraries became among the first public buildings to offer regular hours, electric lights, and accessible space for the working poor. Librarians advocated for free access, for sanitation, for literacy. And all the while they dusted. When dust became political. As libraries became public institutions, questions of cleanliness and order took on political tones. In working-class neighborhoods, libraries were held to high standards of hygiene, as if to compensate for the dirt of the factories and slums outside. Reports were written not just on holdings, but on the frequency of floor polishing, shelf wiping, and curtain washing. One London Borough Council debated whether books borrowed by the poor should be fumigated upon return. Some members suggested that the lower classes carried disease via pages. Librarians resisted. They argued, often with careful evidence, that dust posed more danger to the books than to the patrons. In their quiet way, they defended the dignity of their visitors. To dust the books was a duty. To dust the people was an insult. Legacy in the margins. Most of the 19th century librarians who fought the war on dust are forgotten. Their names appear only in staff rosters, or as faint signatures inside book covers. Their labor is invisible, but it lingers in the survival of the volumes themselves. When you enter a historical library today, perhaps in Oxford or New York, and smell that dry, papery scent of old books, you are experiencing the afterlife of their devotion. Their marginal notes still sit in card catalogs. Their repairs hold spines together. Their records tell us what was borrowed, what was banned, what was lost and later found. They cataloged not just books but time itself. Modern echoes. Today, the war on dust has moved into climate-controlled vaults and digital databases. Libraries now rely on barcodes, temperature sensors, and air filtration systems. Digital preservation promises to outlast the fragility of paper. But even now, in quiet back rooms, librarians still dust. They still inspect bindings. They still fret over humidity. They still write notes in margins. Cover weakening, loose signature, pages need cleaning. The war continues, not for prestige, not for applause, but because, as one 1895 pamphlet declared, a civilization is not judged by what it builds, but by what it preserves. Final reflection. So the next time you hold an old book, its pages yellowed, its corners soft, think of the countless gloved hands that touched it before you. Think of the ladders climbed, the brushes wielded, the hours logged in silence. Think of the dust always returning, always removed. And think of the librarians, those quiet sentinels of the past, who understood that even the most boring battles are worth fighting, if the stakes are memory itself. Story 2. The Mud Clerks led your life in a 19th century river port office. You are sitting at a narrow wooden desk, ink-stained and wobbling, placed by a window that barely opens. Outside, the river glides past, brown, broad, and sluggish. On its surface float barges, paddle steamers, crates tied with hemp rope, and the smell of silt and coal. You are a mud clerk. It's 1854 and your day is just beginning. This isn't the life of a steamboat captain or a daring frontier scout. This is the life of a man with a pen and a ledger, a watcher, a counter, a documenter of goods and time. And without you, the engine of commerce would stall. What is a mud clerk? In the bustling age of 19th century river trade, particularly along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, there existed a class of young men known as mud clerks. They were the lowest-ranking clerks in the steamboat world, unpaid, overworked and perpetually filthy, but they were also the memory of the boat. Their job was to know everything: what was loaded, what was unloaded, who boarded, who departed, and how much it all cost. They were the eyes and ears of the captain, but without the uniform or the respect. Often teenage boys or young men hopping to climb into better roles, mud clerks worked in brutal conditions, usually beginning their day before sunrise and ending well after midnight. They were called mud clerks because they were always in it. When the boat landed at a port, they were the first off the gangplank, boots sinking into the riverside muck to tally cargo and collect paperwork. Rain or shine, low tide or flood, they took notes while soaked through, smeared with ash or ankle-deep in sludge. Their lives were a cycle of numbers, mud, and exhaustion. The river as artery. The 19th century saw rivers function as the lifelines of American commerce. Before reliable railroads or highways, the Mississippi River and its vast network of tributaries carried goods, people, and news across immense distances. Cotton from the South, grain from the Midwest, timber from the forests, and coal from Pennsylvania all passed through the hands and the ledgers of clerks who watched it all from riverbanks and steamboat offices. Port towns like St. Louis, Vicksburg, and Louisville boomed, their docks crowded with crates, pigs, barrels, and men yelling in a dozen languages. For every ton of cargo loaded, there was a ledger line. For every passenger ticket sold, a receipt, and someone had to record it. That someone, more often than not, was a mud clerk with stiff fingers, soggy boots, and an unpaid post. The work begins. A typical day began with checking the manifest, the official document listing all cargo and passengers. But the mud clerk wasn't trusted with the original. Instead, he made copies, often several by hand. No carbon paper, no typewriter, just quill, ink, and the steady rhythm of duplication. These copies would go to various parties, one to the captain, one to the port authority, one to the merchant, one to the ship's own accounting office. The accuracy mattered more than the handwriting. A single error could mean unpaid duties or lost goods, and blame always fell on the lowest-ranked man. Beyond paperwork, the mud clerk had to be physically present during all dockings. He ensured barrels matched the invoice, crates weren't substituted, and names on the ticket list aligned with the people stepping off. He often stood with a crude lantern at midnight as passengers shuffled off in darkness. He memorized faces. He kept track of who snuck aboard, who vanished, and who claimed too many trunks. One journal entry from a steamboat clerk in 1851 reads, "Unloaded 36 barrels of molasses. Manifest said 37. Captain said count again, counted twice, still 36. Found one rolled behind hogshead, smelled broken, syrup spilled in hold, no credit from merchant, loss blamed on me." No room for mistakes. Mud, sweat, and hierarchy. Life on the docks was deeply hierarchical. At the top, the captain, proud, often ill-tempered and untouchable. Next came the first clerk, then second clerk, then engineers, mates, deckhands, firemen, and finally, the mud clerk. He was lower than the cook, lower than the errand boy. He slept in a corner if space allowed, or under the ledger table if not. He ate last, if at all. He washed in the river, cold, brown, and often dangerous. His clothes were never clean, his boots never dry. He smelled of oil, tobacco, ink, and sweat. And yet the mud clerk had an advantage few others did: access to information. He knew the value of goods before they reached the market. He knew who was carrying gold, who was smuggling contraband, and which merchants falsified weights. If he had the nerve, he could sell information quietly, profitably to competitors. Some did, most did not. The work was too hard to risk losing. The ledger as weapon. The ledger was more than a record, it was protection. In an era before digital systems, documentation was the only shield against blame. A mud clerk's careful notes might prove that a crate was short before boarding, not after; that a barrel was tampered with in transit; that a passenger failed to pay. clerks developed systems of annotation shorthand, coded marks, and marginalia. A red X might mean suspicion. A double underline might mark an item of value. These details were not standard. Each clerk developed his own, taught to no one, kept secret in case disputes turned hostile. Disputes were common. Cargo stolen, weights misdeclared, manifests altered after signature. In court, the ledger was the only truth that mattered. Clerks sometimes testified, their handwriting the final word in lawsuits worth thousands. One mud clerk's testimony in 1858 saved his captain from ruin his careful logs, proving a shipment was misloaded by the dockhands in Memphis, not stolen at river. The judge called the young man a master of boring details. The clerk later became head of logistics for a major steam line. Details mattered. Life in the river towns. While steamboats moved, clerks often stayed behind working out of port offices. These were no grand buildings. Most were damp storefronts near the dock, filled with crates, cats, and ledgers stacked high. A clerk might share his space with rats, porters, or the occasional broken crate of onions. From here they wrote invoices, replied to merchant letters, tracked delayed shipments, and handled claims. The pace was slow, but the pressure unrelenting. One missed invoice, and a payment might be withheld for months. One misspelled town name, and a shipment might go to Vicksburg instead of Vincennes. Mistakes were punished not with firing, but with more work. The logic was that only through repetition could a clerk be reformed. A clerk with bad handwriting might be made to rewrite the entire manifest twice. There was little glory in river trade, only endurance. Climbing the ladder. Yet for some, mud clerking was a path upward. A diligent clerk could rise to second clerk, then first clerk, then purser, and eventually captain. It was rare, but not impossible. Mark Twain, born Samuel Clemens, famously started as a riverboat apprentice and became a licensed pilot. Though not a mud clerk himself, he knew many who were, and his early writing reflects their struggles. One of Twain's characters, drawn from life, says, "If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And if you can't find it in the ledger, it was never there to begin with." For many boys in small towns, a clerk's stool by the river was the first rung on a ladder that might lead out of poverty. But most never climbed. They remained watchers, recorders, anonymous, muddy, tired. And their ledgers, many are lost. Some sit in archives unstudied, their pages stiff with time. Names, weights, notes the shadow of trade on a forgotten Tuesday in 1857. But what might those pages still hold? What unseen histories hide in those lists of barrels, crates, and passengers? Imagine this. You are again perched on your stool, your back sore from a day of hunched writing, your fingers stained with ink, and your boots still damp with river sludge. It is late. The docks have quieted, the day's cargo logged, but your work is not over. A flickering oil lamp lights your ledger, and you begin the nightly ritual of reconciling the impossible. Because in the river trade, nothing ever adds up cleanly. You are a mud clerk, and tonight, as on most nights, you're not just accounting, you're untangling a web of misstatements, fudged weights, phantom crates, and vanishing passengers. This is the unseen drama of the river economy, and your only weapon is the ledger. The fragile illusion of order. In theory, every steamboat voyage was a tidy package of entries. X barrels of flour. Y crates of nails. Z passengers with paid fares. In practice, it was a theater of creative accounting. Cargo shifted, labels faded, items fell overboard or were stolen outright. And passengers, they wandered. They boarded without tickets. They paid with promises, or they paid someone else who then forgot to mark the ledger. And always, someone demanded to know where the missing crate went. You, the mud clerk, were expected to know. Hence the ledger, your battlefield. By keeping meticulous records in pencil and ink, in margin and footnote, You created a paper trail that allowed steamboat companies to function across hundreds of miles and dozens of stops. These ledgers were less like books and more like living organisms, scratched-out lines, inserted notes, sudden arrows pointing to see page 43. There were no filing systems. You were the filing system. One surviving logbook from a Louisiana River clerk contains the phrase, "possible duplicate crate check against manifest from Helena," repeated no fewer than 12 times. He likely never found the answer. Memory and the river. The most valuable tool a clerk had wasn't the pen, it was memory. Clerks developed near-photographic recall of cargo contents, merchant reputations, and passenger descriptions. They remembered not just weights and measures, but handwriting styles, conversation tones, and shady behaviors. Memory protected them when paperwork failed. In one case, a clerk in Memphis testified that he remembered seeing a barrel, marked with an unusual loop in the M, on molasses. That loop became evidence in a shipping dispute that went all the way to court. Another clerk recalled a passenger not by name, but by the sulfur smell of his boots. That detail helped identify a missing man and implicated a rival line in negligence. To outsiders, these notes and observations might seem trivial, but for clerks, they were survival. Memory was a defense against blame and against erasure. The paper economy. River trade was not governed by law as much as it was by paper. Receipts, tallies, waybills, and duplicates were currency. Every crate required a note, every delay a report, every discrepancy a letter sent up or down river, and all of it passed through the hands of mud clerks who copied and recopied it into bound ledgers that became, over time, the backbone of commercial trust. Ledgers were so vital that they were sometimes locked up in steel boxes during travel, guarded more closely than the cargo itself. A missing ledger could doom a shipment or unravel a company. And yet these documents were rarely beautiful. Most were smudged, rain-warped, dog-eared. The paper was cheap. The bindings broke. Clerks patched them with glue or string or hope. Some carried small penknives to trim pages or scrape away errors. Others invented their own indexing marks: A* for high-value goods, a dash for suspect entries, a cross for disputed items. The meaning of these marks was rarely recorded. The ledger, like the river, was always changing. Theft and trickery. Not every discrepancy was innocent. Clerks lived in a world of half-truths and quiet thefts. Deckhands might siphon molasses from a barrel and top it with river water. A merchant might pack a crate of luxury cloth beneath sacks of corn to avoid tariffs. A passenger might claim their trunk was lost when in fact it was never shipped. Everyone played the game, but only the clerk was held accountable. Some clerks adapted. They began keeping private ledgers, personal logs that recorded what the official one could not. A note might read, "Crate 88 marked as soap, smells strongly of whiskey. Passenger JT claims to be preacher, paid with fake gold coin, avoid. Captain approved dock bribe at Smith's Landing, $5 from petty cash." These entries were never meant for publication. They were protection, a whispered truth behind the facade of order. In one port city, a long-forgotten trunk of clerks' notebooks was discovered decades later in an attic. Inside were years of gossip, warnings, confessions. One entry read, "We've all lied in these books, but some lies help keep the truth alive." Danger in the details. There were physical risks too. The river was dangerous. Dock planks splintered. Cargo tumbled. Steamboats exploded literally when boilers overheated. Mud clerks had no special protection. They were expected to be present for every loading and unloading, often in the middle of the night, sometimes during storms, always in unsafe conditions. In 1860, a mud clerk named James Harper was crushed between two crates during a hasty port stop. His replacement, assigned the next day, was given no warning. He stepped into the same role and the same boots. Illness was also a constant threat. Malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery haunted the docks, particularly in southern ports. Mosquitoes thrived in the river towns. Clean water was rare. Clerks rarely had time to rest and rarely dared complain. They were replaceable. Climbing out of the mud. For some, the work was worth it. A successful mud clerk might earn a promotion to first clerk and with it, a small wage and a cabin berth. From there, they could rise to become pursers who handled money or agents who ran port offices. Some even became captains or company owners. But this ascent was rare, and the price was steep. Years of exhaustion, isolation, and relentless scrutiny wore most clerks down before they reached higher ranks. Those who made it out were often changed, harder, more cynical, but they also carried a deep respect for the clerical trade, the quiet profession that allowed the steamboat empire to function. In company records and memoirs, successful captains often gave tribute to their mud clerk days, not with nostalgia, but with quiet pride. One wrote, "I learned more in 3 years of muddy boots and unbalanced ledgers than I did in any captain's chair. Out there, soaked and unseen, I learned how the river really worked." Echoes in the archives. Today, few mud clerks are remembered by name. Their ledgers survive in archives, if at all tucked away in gray boxes, rarely read. Historians favor the bold headlines: captains, industrialists, revolutionaries. But the small handwriting of clerks tells a different story. They recorded how trade happened, not just what was traded. They documented the habits of people, the rhythm of ports, the ebb and flow of daily survival. A typical entry might seem dull. 9 barrels flour marked DW, loaded at Baton Rouge, destination Cairo. Top barrel split, contents inspected, repacked, verified. But within that line lies a whole world. The strain of transport, the judgment call of a junior employee, the trust of a merchant, the material link between 2 cities, and a barrel's stubborn resistance to gravity. These were the dramas of boring history, and mud clerks, invisible, uncelebrated, captured them all. But if their ledgers recorded everything, what stories did they leave out? You are standing at the river's edge, a thin layer of mud clinging to your worn leather boots. Behind you, the faint clatter of a steamboat's engine echoes as it prepares to cast off. In your hand is a small, thick-bound ledger, its corners soft with use, its pages inked with 1,000 stories no one will ever read. It's the 1870s, and the age of the mud clerk is beginning to wash away. The ledger, once the lifeblood of river commerce, is being displaced by telegrams, railroads, and machines that run on steel tracks rather than shifting currents. But for now, in this quiet moment at the dockside, you are still needed, still writing, still watching the river. And you are witnessing the end of something much bigger than yourself. Railroads and redundancy. The rise of the American railroad system in the post-Civil War years signaled more than just faster transport. It marked a cultural shift in how goods, people, and information moved. Where rivers meandered, trains cut through. Where ports waited on floods and droughts, rails ran on timetables. Steamboats were no longer the uncontested masters of commerce. Their routes, once crowded with freight and passengers, saw diminishing traffic. Towns that had once thrived on river trade found themselves bypassed by tracks that ran inland, straight and unforgiving. As the boats declined, so did the jobs. Firemen, deckhands, and captains looked to the railways. Clerks did too, but the new system required a different kind of record keeping. Railroads were centralized. Documents were standard. Ledgers were kept in offices far from the tracks, not on platforms beside them. The need for adaptable, mud-covered record keepers diminished. The very imprecision that had made river clerks valuable, their ability to interpret chaos, was seen as a flaw in the railway's culture of precision. A ledger marked in grease-stained shorthand had no place in a rail dispatch office. When ink isn't enough, Some mud clerks transitioned successfully. They traded their soggy boots for dry floors, their hand-drawn tallies for typed reports. They became station agents, freight managers, or junior accountants, but many did not. The skill set they had developed remembering things no one else noticed, tracking items not yet inventoried, improvising when order collapsed was suddenly irrelevant. One clerk wrote in his notebook in 1876, "They ask me to file forms by number. I tell them I can still see the loop in the M from a molasses shipment in 1859. They look at me like I'm mad. Perhaps I am." Even the ledgers themselves, thick, tangible, smeared with human effort, were replaced by standard forms. Blank, pre-printed. No room for marginalia. No notes like "load damaged" but passed inspection by light of lantern. It was efficient, it was progress. It was forgettable. Port towns left behind. The fatting of the mud clerk mirrored the fatting of the towns that had once depended on river commerce. Places like Cairo, Illinois, once a booming transit hub, saw their populations dwindle as the rails took traffic elsewhere. Empty warehouses rotted beside the river. Once crowded docks gathered dust. Office windows, once lit late into the night with the scribbling of clerks balancing cargo receipts, sat dark. And the people who had worked these river towns, many left. Some stayed, unwilling to give up the life they had known, a life where the river dictated time and the ledger recorded its rhythms. In one town, a clerk turned general store owner kept using his steamboat ledger to record grocery purchases. He simply crossed out port of departure and wrote customer name. In the margins, he noted rain levels, ferry arrivals, and when the river froze. His records became a local chronicle. He had spent too long watching the water to stop now. The ledger as eulogy. By the 1880s, many steamboat companies had folded. Some sold their ledgers for scrap. Others buried them in damp basements or left them behind in empty offices. A few were rescued, saved by archivists, librarians, or descendants who understood faintly that these boring books told real stories. The handwriting in those ledgers now serves as one of the only first-hand accounts of daily river trade. They contain not speeches or essays but granular truth. Who loaded what, when they did, what broke, what vanished, what arrived. It is a kind of history that resists drama, and yet is more honest than most. Even the errors speak volumes. A misdated entry here, a smudged total there, a line scratched out in haste. These are not just marks on paper, they are proof of lives lived under pressure, in motion, on muddy ground. And in some cases, the clerks themselves left final notes, unsentimental but revealing. Last entry for this book: boat to be retired, freight to switch to rail, not sure what comes next. Another wrote simply, "This ledger ends, so does my post." Preservation through tedium. The mud clerks did not write for legacy. They wrote because they had to, and in that necessity lies their most enduring value. They recorded not history with a capital H, but the sediment of life, the everyday, the forgotten, the mundane. And by doing so, they preserved the unspoken truth of the 19th century economy, that for every grand journey or daring captain, there were 10,000 quiet hands tracking the crates, filing the receipts, and cleaning ink off their cuffs. They ensured the trains of commerce ran before there were actual trains. They created order on the banks of a churning, often cruel river, and they did it without applause. Today, when historians study antebellum trade, migration, or industrial growth, they turn inevitably to the ledgers. Not because the clerks meant to become immortal, but because they were paying attention when no one else was. Reflection: what is left behind? There's something oddly poetic in the fact that the most forgettable profession of the river age left behind its most enduring record. The captains were admired, the merchants remembered, but it is the clerks who gave us the raw data of the 19th century. Their boring notes became gold. As you close the last page of a mud clerk's ledger, you realize that history is not only made in battlefields or parliaments. Sometimes, it is made in a small room with a damp floor, a flickering lamp, and a man too tired to lift his head but still writing, still watching, still counting. Story 3. The Great British Soap Tax: Hygiene, Poverty, and Rebellion. You stand in a narrow alleyway in 18th-century London. The air smells of soot, sewage, and something less easily named: the dense, sour odor of unwashed humanity. In the cramped homes that line the street, entire families sleep, eat, and live in one room. Water is fetched by bucket. Bathing is rare. Clean clothes rarer still. But here's the strange thing. Soap, that everyday object now so mundane it disappears into routine, was once at the heart of a national controversy. This is the story of how something as boring as soap became a flashpoint for class struggle, political rebellion, and public health. And how, for over a century, a simple bar of soap was a luxury many could not afford, thanks to a government tax that most historians now agree did more harm than good. Cleanliness as a luxury. In the early 1700s, Britain was entering its age of empire. Trade expanded. Colonies grew. Wealth flowed into London from the Caribbean, India, and the Americas. But for the working classes in cities and rural villages alike, conditions were abysmal. Personal hygiene was not a matter of habit. It was a matter of access and cost. Soap, the primary tool for cleaning skin, linens, and clothing, was expensive. And not just because of production costs. It was taxed heavily. By 1712, a series of laws introduced under Queen Anne levied duties on soap makers, production facilities, raw materials like tallow and oil, and the finished soap itself. The justification: soap was considered a luxury good. Parliament believed it was used primarily by the upper classes and therefore could be taxed without burdening the poor. They were wrong. The taxing of cleanliness. The soap tax was part of a broader wave of excise duties introduced during and after Britain's wars with France and Spain. These taxes funded military campaigns, colonial administration, and the ballooning national debt. By the mid-18th century, the tax on soap could add as much as 100% to its retail price. That meant a bar of soap which should have cost a penny might cost 2 or even 3. For the working poor, that was the difference between clean clothes and lice-ridden rags. And the tax wasn't simple. It targeted the production process. Soap makers had to register with the excise office, pay duty on every pound of soap produced, and allow government inspectors to enter their premises at any hour without notice. These inspectors would weigh vats, count ingredients, and seal batches with wax stamps. If soap makers were caught hiding product even by a few ounces, they could be fined, shut down, or imprisoned. In one instance, a soap boiler in Liverpool was jailed for 6 months for underreporting a batch by just 18 pounds. The underground soap economy. As the tax squeezed legal producers, a shadow economy of illicit soap making flourished. In alleyways and rural barns, unlicensed soap was boiled in copper pots, using whatever fat or ash could be obtained. The quality was poor, the smell worse, but it was cheap. Women boiled scraps of fat with wood ash, sometimes with added lime, to create rough cakes of soap. Recipes were passed secretly. Families shared molds. In some villages, soap was traded like currency, passed from one household to the next in return for eggs, coal, or bread. Children were sometimes employed to carry soap in hidden baskets, bypassing toll collectors and excise men. One 1748 report described a gang of washerwomen and boys who smuggled soap from Kent into London by sewing it into false hems in their petticoats. The government responded by increasing inspections, raising penalties, and publicizing arrests. Soap makers were portrayed as criminals, cheats, liars, and smugglers, but the public didn't see them that way. Soap and shame. Cleanliness carried moral weight in 18th century Britain. To be dirty was to be lazy, sinful, or diseased. To be clean was to be civilized, respectable, godly. This idea, reinforced by religious sermons, domestic manuals, and social reformers, created intense pressure to stay clean. But how could one do that if soap was unaffordable? For many working-class women, laundry days became acts of performance. If they couldn't wash clothes properly, they would boil them in plain water, hang them neatly, and sprinkle them with herbs to hide the smell. Some scraped old soap bars down to slivers, softened them with hot water, and pressed them into new shapes and illusion of fresh soap, though they had none. In poor neighborhoods, soap became a quiet indicator of shame or pride. The presence of a soap dish on a shelf was a sign of effort, even if the dish was empty. Reformers began to notice. In the 1780s and 90s, writers like Hannah More and William Wilberforce, more famous today for abolitionism, also began to comment on hygiene. They saw soap as a moral necessity, not a luxury, and they began calling, quietly at first, for reform. But change was slow. The excise office remained powerful, and soap remained taxed. The disease connection. The most tragic consequence of the soap tax was its effect on public health, though it took decades for anyone to recognize it. As cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and London expanded, overcrowding worsened. Sewers were inadequate, fresh water was scarce, and the poor, lacking both space and means, bathed infrequently and washed clothes even less. Epidemics thrived. Typhus, dysentery, and cholera moved swiftly through filthy tenements. Doctors urged cleanliness, but patients had no access to the very tool needed to reduce disease: soap. When cholera struck London in the 1830s and again in the 1850s, reformers began to make the connection. Cleanliness wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity, and taxing soap, they argued, was costing lives. A parliamentary report in 1852 noted that in some areas, an entire block of dwellings shares a single bar of soap, used sparingly, hidden from inspectors. Another report recorded that soap was stolen from hospitals by those desperate to clean their children. Public opinion began to shift. But still the tax remained. Why? It is 1853, and the House of Commons is restless. A minor bill is on the table, yet the gallery is full, the floor tense. Outside, crowds gather along Westminster Bridge. They are not here to protest a war, a new monarch, or a famine. They are here for soap. More specifically, for the repeal of the tax on it. For over 140 years, soap has been taxed in Britain. Generations of families have grown up knowing it as a luxury. Entire businesses have been shaped around dodging it. Now, after decades of pressure, petitions, and public shamming, Parliament is finally considering whether to end what many call the tax on cleanliness. And yet opposition is fierce. Because in 1853, to repeal the soap tax is not just to lower a duty. It is to dismantle a system of revenue, patronage, and control. A tax built to last. The soap excise system had grown into a bureaucratic giant. What began in 1712 as a simple revenue generator had, by the mid-19th century, become a sprawling apparatus. There were dozens of regional excise offices, hundreds of inspectors known as soap gaugers, complex reporting procedures, seals, weights, barrels, and ledgers, and entire careers built on enforcement. The government derived over £1 million per year from the tax, a substantial sum in the mid-1800s. Soap was not only taxed, it was monitored. Manufacturers were required to build special rooms called soap houses, allow daily inspection, pay the tax up front before sale, and store soap in sealed containers until cleared by gaugers. The paperwork was mountainous. One inspector in Bristol recorded that he visited 18 soap boiling sites in a single week, sealing 300 barrels with wax and stamping them with brass. It was dull, repetitive work, but it paid well. Gaugers had secure government jobs with pensions. They had little incentive to recommend the end of the tax that paid their salaries. The push for reform. Still, pressure for change mounted. The Industrial Revolution had transformed British cities into overcrowded, polluted environments. With it came disease, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. Reformers, medical men, and even religious leaders began to see cleanliness not just as morality, but as public duty. Soap became central to their campaigns. The Health of Towns Association, founded in the 1840s, repeatedly petitioned Parliament to repeal the tax. Their arguments were clear. Soap is essential to health. Soap is already expensive to the poor. The tax is regressive, it punishes cleanliness. Lowering the tax will increase usage and decrease disease. Articles appeared in newspapers with titles like Soap and the Suffering Poor, and Taxing Away Health. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick published detailed reports linking poor sanitation to infant mortality and pointed directly at the cost of soap. One pamphlet, widely circulated in 1850, simply read, "How can we ask them to wash if we charge them to do it?" The public speaks. It wasn't just elites calling for change. Working class groups began organizing around the issue. Soap became a symbol. Soap-making women in Liverpool held public demonstrations, waving banners that read, "Free soap, free mothers." Dockworkers in Hull refused to load tax soap for a week, calling it blood soap. In Scotland, a group of housemaids staged a theatrical protest, scrubbing the steps of Parliament with dirty water, chanting, "We clean the nation, now clean the law." Petitions flowed in. One, from Manchester alone, carried over 100,000 signatures. The idea caught on elsewhere. Writers in France and Germany criticized Britain's soap tax as barbaric. An American newspaper declared, "A nation that taxes its soap admits its people are not worth cleaning." By the early 1850s, the tax was increasingly seen as archaic, harmful, and absurd. And yet it remained. Political resistance. Why? Because the tax system wasn't just about soap, it was about control. Excise taxes had long been used to monitor trades deemed morally questionable or potentially unstable. Spirits, tobacco, salt, and soap, industries under excise control, were not merely taxed, they were disciplined. The British government saw regulation as a tool of empire. By monitoring and taxing production, it could prevent smuggling, ensure loyalty, and raise funds for wars and colonies. Some MPs, particularly older, conservative ones, believed repealing the soap tax would open the door to calls for more radical tax reform. They feared loss of control. Others feared economic loss. The £1 million annual revenue had to be replaced somehow. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, initially hesitated. Critics accused him of protecting the Gaugers Guild. And some, of course, simply didn't want to admit they'd been wrong. Gladstone's decision. But in 1853, under mounting public and political pressure, William Gladstone finally acted. In a bold budget speech, he proposed eliminating the tax entirely. His argument was simple and cutting. The tax harmed the poor. It discouraged sanitation. It distorted the soap industry. And most importantly, it no longer made economic sense. He declared, "The day has come when this tax must be washed away for the health of our people and the honor of this house." The chamber was stunned. The speech was met with roaring applause from the reform benches and stony silence from the old guard. Within days, the vote passed. The soap tax was repealed. Aftermath: a nation reacts. The change was immediate. Soap prices dropped by 30–50% within a year. Production soared. Small-scale soap makers previously priced out returned to the trade. New brands emerged, targeting middle-class and working-class families with affordable bars and powders. Advertising boomed. Soap, once discreetly bought in bulk or made at home, became a visible marketed product. Posters declared, "Now clean is for all." Factories hired more workers. Women opened small soap shops. Children learned to wash with actual soap, not just ash water. And the excise inspectors, most were quietly reassigned or retired. A peculiar job, that of the soap gauger, vanished from the face of British bureaucracy almost overnight. Long-term impact. The end of the soap tax was more than a fiscal shift. It marked a cultural transformation. Cleanliness, once the domain of the elite, became a public expectation. The Victorian obsession with hygiene so often mocked had its roots here, in the sudden accessibility of soap. The repeal also served as a model for later public health reforms. The logic that cleanliness and health should not be taxed would influence decisions on water access, waste disposal, and housing. And it became a case study in the unintended consequences of taxation, a lesson still cited by economists today, that when governments tax necessity, they risk punishing survival. But was it enough? Even with cheaper soap, not everyone benefited. Access to clean water remained uneven. Bathing facilities were rare in urban slums. Women still bore the burden of laundry. Soap could clean, but it could not erase poverty. And despite the tax's repeal, hygiene education lagged. Some households simply didn't know how or why to use soap. Reformers began campaigns to teach cleanliness, handing out pamphlets and organizing washing demonstrations. One pamphlet, dated 1856, reads, "Now that soap is free, let us use it. Let our cities not only be fed but cleaned." The year is 1855. In a modest home in Birmingham, a mother scrubs her child's shirt in a wooden tub. The water is hot, the soap lathers easily, and for the first time in her memory, she is not counting every ounce of soap she uses. For over a century, this simple act, washing a child's clothes without guilt or ration, had been out of reach for Britain's working poor. Now it was becoming normal, commonplace, unremarkable. And yet, that's precisely what made it remarkable. The repeal of the soap tax in 1853 had not caused celebration in the streets. No fireworks, no statues. It was not seen as a grand moral victory or a revolution. It simply happened, but the effects rippled through homes, health, and hygiene in ways still felt decades later. This final chapter in the story of the soap tax explores the slow revolution it triggered, not in policy, but in perception, and how a quiet, boring object helped reshape a nation. The business of clean. With the end of the tax, soap production boomed. Freed from the burden of excise inspections, soap manufacturers scaled up operations. Dozens of new brands emerged. Some were local and artisanal, others the early giants of industrial consumer goods. Among these was William Lever, a grocer-turned-entrepreneur who, by the 1880s, would revolutionize the soap industry. In 1885, he introduced Sunlight soap, one of the first pre-wrapped branded soaps made from vegetable oils rather than animal fat. It was gentler, more consistent, and thanks to savvy marketing, widely available to ordinary people. Lever built a company, Lever Brothers, and a model village called Port Sunlight to house and civilize his workers. His soap wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about social engineering. His advertisements promised purity, virtue, and progress. Soap, once a taxed luxury, was now a lifestyle. And it wasn't just Britain. Soap brands multiplied across Europe and North America. Ivory, Pears, Lifebuoy all built their empires on the assumption that every home, regardless of class, needed soap. This assumption, once radical, had become ordinary, and that ordinariness was, in fact, revolutionary. gender, labor, and soap. For many women, the end of the soap tax didn't mean less work. It meant slightly better conditions for the work they were already doing. Laundry remained one of the most labor-intensive tasks in the Victorian household. A single washing day could take 12 hours or more. Hauling water, boiling clothes, scrubbing with boards or brushes, rinsing, wringing, and hanging to dry, often in cold or damp weather. Soap made the process marginally easier, but it didn't change who did the work. Still, access to better soap reduced skin irritation, cleaned clothes more effectively, and allowed women to present their homes and themselves as respectable. For domestic servants, soap became both tool and proof of status. A maid who kept her master's collars snowy white might earn praise, even promotion. In rural villages, the smell of fresh laundry signaled a household that was proper. Soap was power, quiet power, applied daily unnoticed. Cleanliness as virtue and control. With affordable soap came a cultural obsession. Cleanliness became a virtue, almost a moral requirement. Reformers, educators, and religious figures began to speak not just of clean clothes or bodies, but of clean souls. Public campaigns targeted the working poor with slogans like, "Soap is cheaper than sickness," "Clean homes build strong nations," "Wash and be worthy." Cleanliness became a sign of patriotism, of discipline, even of fitness for empire. This had darker undertones. In schools and orphanages, children were scrubbed not out of compassion, but to break them of bad habits. In prisons, washing became a ritual of compliance. Immigrants were bathed at port stations not for health, but for control. Soap had shifted from scarcity to standard, and now to surveillance. It was no longer just about health, it was about conformity. The global reach of soap. As the British Empire expanded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it brought soap along literally and metaphorically. Colonial administrators distributed soap to civilize local populations. Missionaries brought it alongside Bibles. Soldiers carried bars in their packs. Soap became a symbol of British modernity and a tool of cultural imposition. Posters in India, Kenya, and the Caribbean depicted brown children being washed clean physically and spiritually by white hands and imported soap. The message was clear. Cleanliness was Western, and soap was its vessel. Soap companies, now global giants, leaned into this narrative. Lever Brothers, in particular, marketed its products across Africa and Asia using colonial imagery. Their advertisements weren't subtle. They framed soap as the first step toward British identity. The irony: the very soap once denied to Britain's poor was now being used to define superiority over others. Forgotten but enduring. By the early 20th century, few remembered the soap tax. It had slipped into the background, overshadowed by newer reforms, wars, and industrial changes. No monument was ever built to commemorate its repeal. No textbook chapter marked the change. And yet its legacy endured not in statues, but in bathrooms. The shift it triggered from taxation to normalization laid the groundwork for modern hygiene standards. It influenced public health campaigns, domestic product marketing, urban sanitation systems, the development of indoor plumbing, the creation of welfare programs linking cleanliness and morality. Even today, we live in a world shaped by the assumption that soap is essential. We put it in hotel rooms, classrooms, airplane bathrooms almost without thinking. We are taught to wash before meals, after sneezing, before surgery. During pandemics, governments plead, "Wash your hands, often." All of this began with a simple decision: to stop taxing soap. Reflections on the mundane. The soap tax was never a glamorous issue. It didn't inspire revolutions or novels. It lacked the drama of war, the intrigue of politics, or the grandeur of empire. And yet, in its quiet way, It shaped the bodies, habits, and dignity of millions. It reminded a nation that access to cleanliness is not a luxury, but a right. And it revealed a truth still relevant today, that the most powerful forms of injustice are often boring, embedded in policies, prices, and paperwork. And that reform doesn't always come with banners. Sometimes it arrives in a bar of soap. Final thought. As you wash your hands next, pause for a moment. Feel the lather, smell the clean. And remember that there was a time not so long ago when such a simple act was taxed, regulated, and withheld. Not because it was rare, but because it was powerful. And because power, when spread too widely, tends to unsettle those who prefer a quiet kind of control. Story 4. Filed and forgotten: the bureaucracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You sit at a narrow oak desk, surrounded by rows of identical furniture stretching into the quiet distance. The walls are lined with filing cabinets, hundreds of them, each drawer labeled in Gothic script, each drawer filled with forms, forms about forms, and forms explaining those forms. A clerk 2 desks down sneezes. No one looks up. You adjust your collar, reach for your pen, and begin your third report of the day on cow ownership certificates in Bukovina. You are a minor civil servant in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and your job is to manage the infinite paperwork of a state that can barely manage itself. Welcome to the Kafkaesque world of the dual monarchy's bureaucracy, one of the most complex and, oddly, most influential bureaucratic machines in history. The empire of many names and one purpose. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, formally established in 1867, was a political compromise between Austria and Hungary, two dominant powers forced into cooperation after military defeats and growing nationalist pressure. It included modern-day Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, parts of Italy, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, and more. The result was a sprawling, multi-ethnic, multilingual empire with over 50 million people and at least a dozen official languages. It was impossible to govern efficiently, so they tried to govern precisely. The tool they chose was bureaucracy. Endless, intricate, and dull, but also strangely effective. Bureaucracy as glue. Faced with dozens of competing cultures, religions, and nationalist movements, the empire used paperwork as its adhesive. It did not seek to inspire loyalty with grand speeches or violent repression, though both occurred, but through procedure. You could be Czech or Romanian or Serb, but if you lived in the empire, you registered your birth in Vienna's files. You paid taxes filed on standardized Austro-Hungarian forms. You received permits stamped with the imperial seal. Your marriage, your property, your travel all filtered through the same process. It was boring by design. Bureaucracy smoothed over politics. Paper covered cracks. If a region couldn't be made loyal, it could at least be made legible. A minor noble once quipped, "The empire is not held together by the army, but by the accountant." The life of a clerk. Clerks were the empire's foot soldiers. They wore stiff collars, black frock coats, and expressions of deep fatigue. Most had passed civil service exams, rigorous tests of spelling, arithmetic, imperial geography, and penmanship. Many spoke 4 or 5 languages, not for cultural reasons, but because the empire required it. A clerk in Lemberg, modern-day Lviv, might speak Polish, German, Ukrainian, and a bit of Yiddish. A colleague in Trieste might juggle Italian, Slovene, and German. Everything had to be cross-referenced, translated, filed. Each morning began with the ringing of a small bell, signaling the start of work. Desks were opened, inkwells checked, ledgers unwrapped from their cloth covers. And the writing began. Forms, forms, and more forms. Every process had a form. Every form had a protocol. Every protocol had an archive. There were Form 11D, application to transfer agricultural livestock across district lines, required in triplicate. Form 27M, declaration of secondary residence for tax purposes. Form 3X, notification of name change due to marriage or religious conversion. Form 8ZB, supplement, statement of intention to correct clerical errors made on Form 8ZA. Some clerks specialized in form design, others in storage, still others in retrieval, a delicate art involving enormous index books and labyrinthine reference numbers. A missing form was a minor disaster, an unnumbered form, catastrophe. In one tragicomic instance from 1904, a clerk in Galicia was fired for submitting an outdated template of Form 19R. The form itself was unchanged, but the formatting had been revised in the previous month's circular. No one remembered why the change had occurred. But rules were rules. Kafka wasn't joking. Franz Kafka, now synonymous with absurd, nightmarish bureaucracy, worked as a civil servant in the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy in Prague. His job? Managing compensation claims for workplace injuries. He processed hundreds of cases, often involving factory workers, machinery accidents, and legal ambiguities. He was good at his job, efficient, precise, bored. Kafka wrote in the evenings fiction, parables, stories about inscrutable authority and helpless citizens caught in the system. But to Kafka, it wasn't fantasy. It was Tuesday. When the trial begins with a man arrested without knowing his crime, trapped in an endless web of courtrooms, requests, and vague authority, readers might imagine surrealism. Kafka imagined a slightly more complicated version of his office. In a letter to a friend, Kafka once wrote, "My day job is dull, yes, but it is also the clearest window into the empire's soul." The filing system that couldn't forget. Despite the jokes, the empire's bureaucracy was surprisingly effective at preserving information. Birth records from 1870s Croatia, tax documents from 1891 in Bukovina, postal permits from Moravia. Many of these survive legible, categorized, and cross-referenced. The archivists were obsessive. The folders were tied with string, sealed with wax, and stored in underground vaults. Some clerks believed that nothing should be destroyed. In the Ministry of Finance, one official wrote in 1882, "A record may seem useless today, but we do not know what value it may hold in 300 years. That record, a train delay complaint from a pepper merchant in Szeged. It was filed under miscellaneous, agricultural goods. Bureaucratic neutrality. One strange advantage of this bureaucratic obsession, it created a kind of neutral ground in a divided empire. Nationalists couldn't agree on flags, borders, or even alphabet systems, but everyone could agree on the process of getting a permit. It was frustrating. It was slow, but it was fair, at least in appearance. A Serb and a Slovene might resent each other, but both needed Form 4B to register a land transfer. The bureaucratic process, impersonal and inert, offered a sense of order in an empire where little else felt stable. In a way, the forms themselves became symbols of belonging, not to a nation but to a process. And the process, for all its flaws, was dependable. Bureaucracy as identity. Some clerks found meaning in their work. In the city of Graz, an entire family worked in the civil service for 3 generations. Grandfather, father, son, all clerks. Each passed down manuals, notes, preferred ink brands. They referred to one another's filing systems with reverence. In one surviving letter, a clerk writes to his son, "Remember, it is not the emperor who grants order, but the registrar who records it." Others fell into melancholy. A joke circulated. What is the loneliest man in the empire? A clerk with no forms to stamp. But even the disillusioned rarely left. The bureaucracy was dull but secure. It offered pensions, status, and the illusion of progress. Fragile order in a fractured land. As the 20th century dawned, the empire began to fracture. Nationalism surged. The Balkans burned, war loomed. But inside the ministries and municipal offices, the work continued. Reports were typed, permits issued, cattle registries updated. Even as Sarajevo exploded in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, some clerks recorded births and deaths that very afternoon, unaware they had just witnessed the beginning of World War I. The empire would collapse in 1918, but its filing cabinets would remain standing. For decades. It is 1897, and you are now a mid-level clerk in the Ministry of Agriculture, housed in a gray, echoing building in Vienna. Outside, carriages rattle past and students protest in the university district. Inside, all is hushed except for the gentle tapping of pens, the quiet thump of ink blotters, and the rhythmic ka-chunk of a seal press being used, again and again, on stacks of parchment. A new shipment of tax records has arrived from Dalmatia. They are in Italian. They must be translated into German, registered under 3 separate categories, and cross-referenced with older entries written in Croatian, recorded 30 years prior, when the administrative region had different boundaries and an entirely different bureaucratic code. This is your job. You will not finish today. You may not finish this year. The infinite file room. At the heart of many ministries in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were the file room's vast, windowless spaces filled with shelves stacked high with boxes, ledgers, and bound volumes. Some had rolling ladders. Others relied on small boys hired to fetch documents from upper levels, navigating a maze of labels, categories, and paper dust. The humidity was carefully monitored. Lights were kept low to preserve ink. The oldest records were tied with waxed thread and stored in sealed cupboards. A clerk's mistake in filing could mean the loss of a permit, a title deed, or an entire noble family's history. Some documents were indexed not by subject or date, but by form, lineage A system, where every modified version of a form was cross-linked to every previous version it replaced. It could take days just to locate the correct edition. And then, once found, the document had to be duplicated by hand. Duplication without machines. Typewriters began appearing in Vienna's larger offices by the 1880s, but many departments resisted them. Typewritten documents were seen as impersonal, possibly even untrustworthy. Ink and pen were considered more permanent. Elegant cursive was preferred over the clack of modern keys. Some ministries banned typewriters entirely until the 20th century. In others, a few were allowed but kept in locked rooms, operated only by trained specialists, usually women, who were paid less than male clerks and not eligible for pensions. For everyone else, duplication meant writing the same document 3 or 4 times slowly, neatly, without error. To aid in this task, clerks practiced mirror writing, pressing fresh ink copies between wax sheets to create reverse duplicates. A complicated and messy affair, it worked only for short memos. For larger records, there was no shortcut, just ink, blotter, hand, and time. The seal and the stamp. Authority in the empire was confirmed not by voice, or uniform, or gesture, but by stamp. Rubber stamps, wax seals, inked punches each represented a level of approval, a chain of legitimacy. A blue seal might mean provisional approval. A red wax seal indicated legal finality. A double-stamped form might mean cross-regional clearance. A missing seal meant the entire process had to begin again. The empire trained its clerks in stamp protocol. There were instructional charts, manuals, even internal audits to ensure stamp usage followed the correct order. In one notorious incident from 1902, a shipment of mail between Hungary and Bohemia was delayed 6 weeks because the wrong stamp had been applied to a forestry regulation form. The form was valid, the content correct, but the seal had been placed in the upper right instead of lower left. The document was returned, processed again, resealed. No one protested. Clerks and the calendar. The bureaucratic calendar was a unique creature. Civil servants followed a year not based on seasons but deadlines, quarterly audits, annual censuses, tax rotations, permit renewals, and census updates. Each task had a rhythm and each was layered over the others. For example, an agricultural officer in Bukovina might spend spring verifying pig counts, summer recording hay production, autumn checking irrigation permits, and winter updating family property ledgers. And then the cycle would repeat. The same forms, the same fields, the same names year after year with only small details changing. A new birth here, a field sold there, a widow added, a soldier gone. To outsiders, it might seem numbing. But to the bureaucrats, it was order and, for some, comfort. A system that kept the empire breathing, however quietly. Filing death and life. One of the most solemn responsibilities of the clerks was managing vital records, births, deaths, marriages. Each required a certificate. Each certificate required witnesses. Each witness had to be recorded, their name spelled correctly, their place of residence cross-checked. When someone died, a local priest might fill out a temporary notice. That notice had to be delivered by horse or train to the nearest registrar. From there, a clerk would copy the information onto a permanent form, index it under the proper year, and notify regional offices if inheritance or property was involved. But if the form arrived damaged, unclear, or late, it was returned. Delays could last months. Entire estates sat in limbo. Widows waited for pensions. Orphans went unrecognized, all because the original form had been smeared by rain or because someone's name was misspelled. Bureaucracy versus revolution. Ironically, during periods of political unrest, the bureaucracy often continued unaffected. In 1848, as revolutionary protests broke out across Vienna, clerks in the Ministry of the Interior reportedly remained at their desks, processing land registries. When asked why, one replied, "The protesters will come and go, but the tax declarations must still be completed." And so they were. Even during World War I, as supplies dwindled and the monarchy trembled, the bureaucratic machine kept filing. A 1916 memo from the Ministry of Railways calmly reminded clerks to continue updating their bridge inspection reports, even if bridges were bombed or seized. Order, they believed, must be documented even in chaos. The anonymous engine. By the early 20th century, the empire's bureaucracy had become its most consistent institution. Monarchs came and went, prime ministers shifted, armies marched, but the clerks stayed. They did not ask to be remembered. They did not write speeches or lead campaigns, but they ensured. Grain deliveries were recorded, taxes collected, soldiers drafted, courts scheduled, and everything was written down. They were anonymous, boring, replaceable. But they were also the memory of the empire. But what happens when the memory outlasts the body? When the filing cabinets remain, but the state they once served no longer exists? It is November 1918. The war has ended. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that immense patchwork of peoples, provinces, and paperwork, is no more. In Vienna, the imperial flag is lowered. In Budapest, Hungarian politicians declare independence. In Prague, a new republic is born. Across the Balkans, governments rise overnight. Monarchs abdicate. Borders vanish. New names are printed on maps before the ink from the old ones is dry. And in a government office in Trieste, a clerk silently places a final stamp on a livestock registry form. The empire, as a political entity, has ceased to exist, but the filing system hasn't. The cabinets are still there, the ledgers still open, the bureaucrats still sitting at their desks. For decades, they kept track of everything. Now, no one is entirely sure what they're supposed to track. Collapse by memorandum. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't happen all at once. It happened in fragments, proclamations, telegrams, meetings, rumors. In the meantime, the machine of government kept running on inertia. In Prague, officials continued sending tax reports to Vienna for weeks after Czechoslovakia had declared independence. In Sarajevo, birth records were still being processed using imperial forms well into 1919. In some rural towns, no one even told the local clerks the empire had ended, so they just kept working. One Romanian soldier, occupying a government office in Bukovina in early 1919, found 3 Austrian clerks still filing land registries. They had received no orders to stop. Their explanation: until someone tells us otherwise, the forms must be completed. A surplus of memory. The empire may have vanished, but its memory remained encoded in paper. Each province, town, and hamlet had decades, sometimes centuries, of detailed records. Tax rolls, cattle tallies, church registries, property deeds, permits for everything from parades to pig slaughter. This bureaucratic inheritance was vast and confusing. When successor states took over, they faced an impossible task: what to do with the files. In Hungary, bureaucrats debated whether to destroy Austrian language records. In Slovakia, new officials couldn't read the German formatted tax forms. In Croatia, new documents had to be created, but no one was quite sure which forms to replace. And in many places, former imperial clerks, now stateless civil servants, kept working under the new authorities. They didn't ask who ruled. They just asked which form to use. The bureaucrats' survival. Some clerks thrived amid the chaos. The demand for administrative experience skyrocketed. New governments needed trained staff, and the imperial system had produced thousands of them. A Czech clerk who once filed inheritance claims in Olomouc became a municipal secretary in Brno. A Hungarian tax officer from Debrecen was hired by Romania to build their new land registry. An ethnic German from Ljubljana found work in Italian Trieste because he spoke 4 languages and could organize border crossing permits. They brought with them not just experience but methods, filing systems, ledger styles, stamp protocols. Even the old ink blotters and paper stocks were reused in the new regimes. In this way, the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy outlived the empire that created it. Bureaucracy without empire. By the 1920s, most successor states had established their own bureaucracies, but the DNA of the old system lingered. The habit of triplicate forms, for example, remained common in Hungary, Austria, and Czechoslovakia for decades. The love of standardized codes, stamped books, and hierarchical signatures survived in Balkan offices well into the Cold War. Some archives simply relabeled the imperial cabinets. The contents remained unchanged, only the cover page bore a new national emblem. One archive in Ljubljana preserved over 400,000 imperial-era documents untouched until the 1970s. When researchers opened them, they found permits for bridge repairs, school reports for children born in 1863, police memos about unsanctioned musical performances, and hundreds of Form 23D, authorization for the celebration of public holidays. All filed perfectly. Kafka after Kafka. Even after the empire, the image of the imperial bureaucracy haunted European culture. France, Kafka's posthumous fame grew, and with it, the idea that the empire's dull machinery represented something more terrifying, an indifferent, faceless system that consumed people. And yet many former clerks remembered their work fondly. A 1932 interview with a retired clerk in Graz revealed this sentiment. "We were not powerful, but we knew everything, where the bridges were, how many pigs in each village, who married whom. It was dull, but it was beautiful in its way." To them, the forms were not oppression. They were order, memory, proof that something somewhere was being taken seriously. The historical treasure trove. Today, historians depend on the work of these forgotten clerks. The Austro-Hungarian archive system, because of its obsessive detail, preserved more information about ordinary life than nearly any other 19th-century state. Scholars studying agricultural patterns, migration, language use, industrial growth, epidemics, often turn to dusty imperial ledgers that recorded not just the big events but the boring ones. A cow's death, a missing cartwheel, a dispute over sidewalk paving. Even the censuses, notorious for their complexity, offered rare insights into multi-ethnic communities and religious affiliations. And it all exists because someone once filed it properly. The final clerk. In 1953, 35 years after the empire's collapse, a newspaper in Vienna ran a story about the last imperial clerk. His name was Herr Karl Schreiber, and he had joined the civil service in 1908 as a file assistant in the Ministry of Education. He never left. Though ministries were reorganized, names changed, and Austria went through fascism, war, and occupation, Schreiber stayed at his desk sorting forms, restamping old permits, and refiling university records dating back to 1892. When asked why, he reportedly replied, "The state may change, but the files remain. Someone must keep them." He died in 1955. At his funeral, colleagues placed a fountain pen and blotter on the casket. A final stamp for a lifetime of forgotten forms. Reflection, the power of the boring. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is often remembered for its complexity, its eventual collapse, and its inability to manage nationalism. But perhaps its most enduring legacy was its bureaucracy, not the mistakes it made, but the memory it preserved. The clerks did not shape policy. They did not wage wars or sign treaties. But they wrote down everything. And in doing so, they gave shape to a world that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. Not with drama, but with detail. Story 5. The Pencil Revolution, Graphite, Wood, and Global Trade. It begins with a faint scratch, a line drawn across coarse paper, soft but clear. Not ink, not charcoal, something smoother, quieter, a pencil. You hold it now, a stub maybe, worn down from use. You don't think about it, it's simply there, disposable, boring. But the pencil, simple, silent, and easily lost, helped shape modern life in ways few tools ever have. Behind this seemingly trivial object lies a story of resource wars, smuggling, industrial espionage, revolutionary ideas, and international trade. It is a tale without generals or kings, and yet it's one of the most enduring revolutions in human productivity. This is the story of how the pencil, once a rare commodity, became a global necessity, and why entire industries fought to control its materials. The problem of writing. Before the modern pencil, people had options, none of them great. Ink pens were expensive, messy, and fragile. They required frequent dipping, had no erasers, and were difficult to carry. Charcoal broke easily and smudged. Styluses and slate tablets were reusable but cumbersome and limited in permanence. Then, sometime in the late 16th century, in the hills of Borrowdale, England, a curious material was discovered: pure, solid graphite. Local farmers first used it to mark sheep. It left a dark, durable line, didn't crumble like charcoal, and could be cut into sticks. It was called plumbago, meaning black lead, though, chemically speaking, it wasn't lead at all. Still, the name stuck. And so began the pencil's unlikely journey. Borrowdale's black gold. The graphite in Borrowdale was unusually pure, a geological fluke. It could be sawn into solid chunks, unlike lower-quality graphite found elsewhere, which was powdery or mixed with impurities. England quickly realized it had something valuable. In the 17th and 18th centuries, borrowed graphite was considered a strategic resource. It was essential not just for writing tools, but also for cannonball molds, where its heat resistance and smooth texture made it ideal. To protect the resource, the English crown declared the Borrowdale graphite mine a military asset. Armed guards were posted. Mining was strictly controlled. The mine was opened only in certain seasons when it could be emptied quickly and the supply secured. Smuggling was rampant. Locals dug secret shafts. Graphite was carried away in boots, baskets, even hollowed-out loaves of bread. Punishments were harsh. One smuggler's diary from 1751 described graphite as more dear than silver, for it writes the words of men and war alike. From stick to pencil. Early pencils were not pencils as we know them. The pure graphite was wrapped in string or inserted into hollowed wood pieces. They were handmade, fragile, and used primarily by artists, architects, and military engineers. The first mass-produced wooden pencils were made in Nuremberg, Germany, in the mid-17th century. German artisans glued two wooden halves around a graphite stick, creating the familiar shape we still use today. But access to high-quality graphite was limited. Most of the world had only powdery forms, which crumbled under pressure. That changed in 1795, thanks to a young French artillery officer named Nicolas Jacques Conté. Conté's crucial innovation. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain blocked exports of Borrowdale graphite to France, cutting off French engineers, draftsmen, and soldiers from a vital tool. Conté was ordered to solve the problem. His breakthrough was elegant. He mixed powdered graphite with clay, then fired the mixture in a kiln. By adjusting the ratio of graphite to clay, he could create different hardness levels, softer for artists, harder for drafting. The modern pencil lead was born. Conté's process not only liberated France from dependence on English graphite, it also democratized pencil manufacturing. Lower quality graphite from elsewhere could now be used. Production expanded rapidly. Conté pencils became standard in the French army, then spread across Europe. His method is still used today. The age of pencil empires. By the 19th century, the pencil was a booming industry and a symbol of modernity. New companies arose, some of which remain household names. Faber, Germany. Steitler, Germany. Dixon, USA. Koh-i-Noor, Austria-Hungary, now Czech Republic. Derwent, UK. Each developed its own grading system, branding, and packaging. Pencils were advertised not just for writing, but for precision, cleanliness, and class. The pencil became a tool of surveyors mapping railroads, engineers designing factories, clerks keeping ledgers, artists sketching cities, children learning letters. In factories, pencils replaced ink for quality control. In battlefields, they were preferred because they didn't freeze or leak. By 1850, the pencil was no longer a novelty. It was infrastructure. But it still relied on two fragile materials, graphite and wood. The wood wars. The ideal wood for pencils was and still is eastern red cedar, native to the United States. It's soft, splits evenly, and holds its shape. In the 19th century, this led to the rise of American pencil companies, particularly in Tennessee and California. The Tennessee Pencil Company and others harvested vast cedar forests to feed growing demand. Logs were shipped across the Atlantic to European pencil makers, until American firms began to dominate the trade themselves. Deforestation followed. By the early 1900s, pencil manufacturers faced shortages. They responded by recycling scraps, switching to incense cedar, importing wood from Africa, South America, and Asia, exploring synthetic casings. Some experimented with recycled paper, plastic, or compressed sawdust with mixed success. The pencil industry became a case study in global resource dependence, all for a tool few people ever thought about. The pencil's hidden life. Behind every pencil is a global supply chain. Graphite from China, Brazil, or Canada. Clay from Germany or the US. Cedar from California or Mozambique. Metal ferrules from the Czech Republic. Erasers from Malaysian rubber or synthetic latex. Each pencil passes through dozens of hands, machines, and borders. And yet when it reaches your desk, it's almost invisible. That invisibility is its genius. A revolution without slogans. The pencil didn't arrive with fanfare. No one rioted for pencils. No governments collapsed over graphite. And yet it quietly empowered students, scientists, journalists, prisoners, inventors, revolutionaries. In letters from war zones, pencil marks outlasted bullets. In notebooks, theories were sketched that changed science. In prison cells, dissidents wrote manifestos. In classrooms, children discovered the alphabet. All in graphite and cedar. But what happens when we stop noticing the tool? When something once revolutionary becomes too boring to see. The pencil has no army, no anthem, no palace. Yet in the background of empire, it moves quietly across continents, borders, and revolutions. It has written peace treaties and shopping lists, architectural blueprints and field notes from trenches. It has recorded censuses, signed marriage certificates, and drafted constitutions. It also became an unlikely casualty of global conflict. By the 20th century, the pencil was no longer just a writing instrument, it was infrastructure. And when the world went to war, pencils were drafted too. Pencils in uniform. During World War I, pencils became an essential tool of communication, logistics, and intelligence. In trenches, where ink froze or spilled, pencils thrived. Soldiers wrote letters home with them, kept logs, recorded casualties. Engineers mapped trenches with Conte-style leads, easy to erase, easy to conceal. Field agents carried short trench pencils, sometimes made from shell casings, in breast pockets. The British War Office issued millions of pencils during the war. And in the US, when the nation entered the war in 1917, the government ordered massive quantities of pencils from American companies, which led to shortages in schools and offices. Some factories pivoted entirely to military contracts. The pencil became a tool of survival. Sabotage in the supply chain. But while soldiers used pencils on the front, battles also took place behind the scenes in the materials. The best graphite for pencil making still came from a few major deposits, primarily Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Canada, and Bavaria. When Germany went to war, it disrupted the global graphite trade. British firms scrambled to secure non-German sources. American companies seized the opportunity, rapidly developing new graphite mines in California and Alaska. Espionage followed. Documents from the U.S. War Department in 1918 revealed that German agents had attempted to disrupt American graphite exports by tampering with shipments and bribing customs officials. Meanwhile, the French government stockpiled Conte-style clay graphite formulas and began secret development of war-grade pencils, with harder leads for wet conditions and special erasers that worked in damp weather. Yes, erasers became a military issue. The Great Eraser Race. The eraser, so often forgotten, was itself a product of trade and innovation. Until the 1770s, people used bits of bread or cloth to erase graphite. Then, Joseph Priestley discovered that a rubbery substance from South America, caoutchouc, could do the job better. The problem, it spoiled easily. In 1839, Charles Goodyear developed vulcanized rubber, durable, flexible, and ideal for erasers. Soon, erasers were attached to pencil ends, creating the now ubiquitous pencil with eraser. But not everyone approved. Some thought it encouraged carelessness. In Britain, erasers were sold separately well into the 20th century. The Japanese eraser industry grew rapidly in the early 1900s, exporting erasers across Asia. During World War II, however, rubber supplies dried up. The war had cut off access to plantations in Southeast Asia. Pencil companies scrambled for substitutes. Wax erasers, plastic erasers, even sandpaper. During the war, erasers became strategic materials, rationed and restricted. The absence of erasers meant fewer drafts and more permanent mistakes. Pencils behind enemy lines. Perhaps the most peculiar pencil-related military story comes from World War II. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, developed a variety of concealed weapons and tools for spies and resistance fighters, and one of them was a pencil with a hidden message scroll. Others included pencils filled with maps, pencils containing miniature compasses, exploding pencils, small bombs for sabotage missions, inkless pencils that wrote in invisible chemicals, revealed with heat or light. A typical field agent carried a pencil that looked ordinary, but unscrewed to reveal tools or orders. To the casual observer, it was just another writing implement. To the resistance, it was survival. The business of boredom. Back in the civilian world, the pencil continued its quiet conquest. By the 1930s, global demand had made pencil making a vast, multinational industry. Factories churned out school pencils, drafting pencils, colored pencils for cartographers, artist-grade pencil with precise graphite clay blends, carpenter pencils flat so they wouldn't roll away on slanted surfaces. In the United States, John Steinbeck famously requested specific models of pencils, preferring the Blackwing 602, and reportedly used over 300 while writing East of Eden. Pencil collecting even became a hobby. Some connoisseurs tracked lead darkness, wood grain, ferrule design, and eraser durability. Entire departments in government and industry were staffed with pencil men, who specialized in formulating the perfect blend of hardness and darkness. Pencils were big business, and yet almost invisible in daily life. The bureaucrat's companion. As with the Austro-Hungarian clerks, the pencil became the lifeblood of modern administration. In colonial offices, land surveys were drafted in pencil. In factories, production reports were tallied on pencil-marked forms. In schools, generations of students wrote and erased their way through arithmetic drills and spelling tests. The pencil was especially important in nations with high humidity where ink smudged, limited access to paper, erasures extended paper life, multilingual populations where revisions were frequent. In India, Ghana, and Southeast Asia, pencils became tools of bureaucracy and education alike. And while fountain pens were status symbols, pencils were egalitarian, used by all, noticed by none. The socialist pencil. In the Soviet Union, the pencil became both a symbol of labor and a tool of control. Soviet factories mass-produced pencils with slogans like, "Think clearly, work proudly," "Pencil in hand, future in sight." Erasure is a privilege, not a right. The government tightly controlled access to foreign-made pencils, but ironically prized German pencils, especially Faber-Castell, became black market commodities. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers depended on specialized graphite pencils for design, especially in aviation and space projects. In fact, during the Cold War, a myth emerged in the West that NASA spent millions developing a space pen, while the Soviets just used pencils. It's not quite true, but it reflects a certain romanticism about simplicity. In truth, Both agencies used pencils until graphite dust in zero gravity proved hazardous to electronics. But by then, the pencil had already left Earth. Vanishing point. Today, pencils seem to be in decline. Digital tablets, laptops, styluses, voice-to-text, we write differently now. Yet over 14 billion pencils are still manufactured, every year enough to circle the Earth dozens of times. Artists, architects, carpenters, and teachers still rely on them. And in some regions, the pencil remains the only writing tool available, cheaper, simpler, more forgiving than anything else. The modern pencil, born from smuggling, refined by war, and shaped by global trade, continues quietly. You may not notice it, but your world was drawn with it. But what will remain when the last pencil is used? A smudge on the page or the memory of a quiet revolution? Let's pause and look down. You might be holding one right now. A pencil, cedar body, graphite core, eraser on top, likely manufactured in some faraway factory. Cheap, unremarkable, you sharpen it, use it, forget it, and yet it lingers. Not in grandeur, but in quiet persistence. Pencils have outlived empires, industries, and ideologies. Their role has changed. Their materials have evolved, but the principle, marking a surface with controlled friction, remains the same. And even as the digital age erases handwriting from daily life, the pencil persists in unexpected places. The pencil and the test. In classrooms across the world, the pencil still reigns supreme during standardized testing. Why? Because of the Scantron machine, that omnipresent gray box that reads fill-in-the-bubble answers. For over half a century, these machines have required number 2 pencils, not ink, not markers, not pens. The reason is simple. Number 2, graphite, a specific balance of darkness and hardness, reflects just the right amount of infrared light for the scanner to read. Too hard and the mark is too light. Too soft and it smudges or saturates. Entire generations have taken exams under this regime. SATs, GREs, LSATs, high school entrance tests, bureaucratic civil service exams. The pencil became a gatekeeper of mobility, a passport to college, a quiet tool of merit or exclusion. Even as digital testing expands, millions of students still clutch their pencils each year, as if holding a small piece of ritual. Artists and draftsmen, the last craftsmen of graphite. In the age of tablets and vector graphics, the pencil is still a tool of choice for some of the world's most skilled creators. Why? Because it allows error, it allows feeling, it's imprecise in the best way. An architect's initial sketch, a fashion designer's first silhouette, an animator's thumbnail storyboard, these are rarely born on screens. Instead, they emerge from the tactile feedback of lead on paper. The pressure, the tilt, the smudge, things software can't quite replicate. Master draftsmen often carry entire pencil sets from 9H Ultra Hard to 9B Ultra Soft, using each grade for light, shadow, and tone. To them, the pencil isn't crude, it's sensitive. Space pencils and the myth of simplicity. The Cold War gave us the most famous pencil myth of all. NASA spent millions developing a space pen. The Russians used a pencil. It's a good story. It's also false, or at least misleading. Both NASA and the Soviet space program used pencils in early space missions, but graphite posed a danger in microgravity. Tiny flakes could float into sensitive instruments or be inhaled. So both agencies eventually switched to the Fisher space pen, which uses pressurized ink cartridges that write in zero gravity, underwater, upside down, and in extreme temperatures. But the pencil got there first. It was the first writing tool to enter space, and it remains, in certain applications, a fallback, reliable, lightweight, and mechanically simple. No batteries, no refills, no cap. Just graphite. The pencil's philosophers. Some thinkers saw in the pencil more than just a writing tool. In 1958, economist Leonard Read published the essay Pencil, a fictional autobiography of a pencil narrating how no single person knows how to make one. It describes the graphite miners in Sri Lanka, loggers in Oregon, factory workers in Indonesia, truck drivers in Mexico, metalworkers crafting the ferrule in Connecticut. The point, a pencil, simple as it seems, is the result of global cooperation, none of it centrally planned. This became a parable for free market economics, but it also unintentionally illustrated something deeper. How even the most boring object in your hand contains hundreds of invisible hands. Resistance in wood. During authoritarian regimes, pencils have played subtle roles. In Franco's Spain, dissidents smuggled messages written in pencil on cigarette rolling paper. In apartheid South Africa, prisoners at Robben Island used pencils to draft manifestos. In East Germany, schoolchildren were taught to resharpen their pencils endlessly, as an exercise in thrift, a thinly veiled metaphor for obedience. But sometimes, the pencil defied those lessons. It allowed people to speak, erase, try again. It offered the opposite of permanence, the possibility of revision. That's why teachers love them, and why regimes often didn't. The eco-pencil and its modern return. In the 21st century, the pencil is undergoing a quiet rebrand. In an age of sustainability, the pencil offers something rare. It is biodegradable. It is renewable. It requires no electricity. It is cheap, durable, recyclable. New companies have emerged promoting eco-friendly pencils made from recycled newspaper, coffee grounds, bamboo, even old denim. Some contain seeds in the eraser cap, plant the pencil stub, and basil or wildflowers grow. It's a clever gimmick, but also a signal. Even in obsolescence, the pencil finds ways to resist finality. Forgotten but not gone. And so we return to the pencil at your desk, or in a drawer, or under the couch. It's easy to forget, but if you pick it up, you're holding a 500-year-old technology, a product of smuggling, secrecy, and scientific innovation, a relic of military logistics and school tests, a whisper of vanished forests and collapsing empires, a tool that shaped revolutions in art, science, and politics. All in your hand, all erasable. The pencil as a mirror. In the end, the pencil reflects us. It marks our beginnings, first letters, first drawings. It records our plans, to-do lists, ideas, dreams. It allows us to erase, to change our minds, revise, improve. It wears down as we use it until it disappears. It is, in its own way, mortal. And perhaps that's why we're drawn to it. Not because it lasts forever, but because it reminds us that nothing does, and that's okay. A pencil cannot shout, but it can record. And in the boring, quiet scratches of graphite on paper, it has captured centuries of human ambition, one erased mistake at a time. Story 6. The clockmaker's silence regulating time in pre-industrial Europe. You glance at the clock, perhaps on a wall, a wrist, or your screen. The minutes tick forward. The hours pass. It's structured, familiar, inescapable. But what if there was a time when time itself wasn't fixed? Before industrialization, before train schedules and factory whistles, time was fluid, and clocks were not merely instruments but instruments of power. This is the story of how Europe slowly, unevenly, and often reluctantly gave up seasonal rhythms, solar shadows, and communal bells in favor of the measured tick of mechanical precision. Not a revolution of machines, but of silence, of gears turning behind closed doors, of order emerging not with a bang but with a chime. Welcome to the age before time was standardized, and the quiet rebellion of those who began to count it. Life without clocks. In early medieval Europe, time was something you lived through, not something you measured. Days were divided loosely. Dawn meant waking and work. Noon was when the sun stood highest. Dusk ended labor. The night followed the moon, stars, and weather. In many villages, the rhythm was set by natural cues: the position of the sun, the crowing of roosters, or the local church bell. Time was communal, not personal. People acted together, sowing, harvesting, feasting, praying according to shared cycles rather than exact hours. Watches did not exist, clocks were rare, and for most, minutes were meaningless. But something was changing. Monks and the divine hours. If medieval Europe had timekeepers, they wore robes. The Benedictine monks, as early as the 6th century, organized their day around a rigorous schedule of canonical hours, set prayers and rituals repeated throughout the day and night. Matins, midnight, or very early morning. Lauds before dawn. Prime around 6 a.m. Terce sext, none roughly 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. Vespers, sunset. Compline before sleep. To observe these hours, monasteries developed mechanical devices to mark the passing of time. These early clocks were not precise. They often relied on water drips, candle markings, or rotating discs, but they introduced a crucial shift. Stopwatch time became divisible. And once it could be divided, it could be regulated. The rise of public clocks. By the 13th century, towns across Europe began installing tower clocks not to inform the public, but to assert civic order. The first mechanical clocks were loud, not accurate. They struck bells on the hour but often didn't have faces or hands. Why? Because people couldn't read time but they could hear it. Cities like Milan, Rouen, and Salisbury built elaborate clock towers to show their sophistication and power. Time was no longer only sacred, it was becoming secular. Merchants wanted it, courts demanded it, schools needed it. But even as clocks multiplied, their readings often differed. One town's noon might be another's 10:45. There was no standard time, only local time. And in that confusion, clockmakers quietly worked. The secretive craft of horologists. In medieval Europe, clockmaking was as much art as engineering. Horologists, clockmakers, were members of elite guilds, often protected by royal charters. Their skills were closely guarded. A single mechanical clock could take years to construct and cost as much as a small castle. Many early mechanisms were powered by weights, not springs, and needed frequent adjustment. Clockmakers kept trade secrets, passed from master to apprentice, hidden from the public. Even their calibration methods, often based on sundials or stellar movements, were cloaked in ritual. Clocks were status symbols, not practical tools. In courts and universities, a clock meant order. But for most villagers, the bell still rang when the priest or mayor said it should not, when gears dictated. And that discrepancy between mechanical and human time would grow. The ticking infiltration. By the late 15th century, spring-driven clocks allowed timepieces to shrink. No longer confined to towers or walls, clocks could be installed in chambers, studies, gyps, eventually pockets. This was revolutionary, not because more people had clocks, but because the elite could now carry time with them. Portable clocks allowed rulers, merchants, and scholars to enforce their own schedule, not just follow communal rhythms. In effect, time became personal. And this was deeply unsettling to many. Resisting the clock. The growing presence of clocks caused unease. In sermons, some preachers condemned them as tools of vanity or even heresy, arguing that only God should measure time. Peasants mocked city dwellers who watched the sky through gears. In rural France, some villages reportedly ignored tower bells, clinging instead to ancestral cues: birdsong, shadow length, and seasonal smells. A 1491 record from the Alsace region includes a complaint. The mayor rings the hour, but the cows do not believe him. The phrase became proverbial, a reminder that nature was not yet subordinate to machines. But the machines were multiplying toward chronological control. By the early 17th century, mechanical clocks were in high demand in market towns, where trade fairs required schedules; harbors, where tides and arrivals needed tracking; courts, where legal documents were time-stamped; universities, which began ringing bells to signal lectures and prayers. The age of discovery, with its long sea voyages and navigation challenges, also pushed clock innovation. Accurate timekeeping became essential for longitude calculation, though true solutions would come much later. The clock was no longer a curiosity. It was a tool of authority. But what happens when time, once sacred and communal, becomes commercial, even oppressive? What happens when people must live by the tick? It was not war, nor plague, nor divine decree that most reshaped the way Europeans lived from the 17th to 19th centuries. It was something quieter. The tick. That faint, measured rhythm, once hidden in cathedrals and monasteries, had slipped into homes, factories, and schools, unnoticed at first, unresisted later. And slowly, it changed how people thought, worked, and even understood their very lives. This section tells the story of time discipline, how mechanical clocks taught people to live by the hour, rather than by the sun, the bell, or the body. Not all welcomed it, but in time few escaped it. The industrial precursor, time in the guild world. Before factories, Europe was already full of regulated labor. Guilds, cooperatives of artisans and tradesmen, managed everything from apprenticeship terms to working hours. But these were often flexible, tied to daylight, market days, or religious holidays. For example, a shoemaker might begin work at dawn and finish before vespers. A blacksmith might adjust his schedule with the seasons. A cloth merchant might close for a saint's day or for a heavy fog. Time was negotiated, not enforced. Even in cities, clocks mostly rang out for public functions, town meetings, sermons, or the start of curfew. Few workers had personal timepieces, few needed them. Until they did. The silent teachers, schools, and bells. One of the earliest institutions to normalize hourly life wasn't the factory. It was the school. By the mid-17th century, Jesuit and Protestant schools across Europe began adopting structured timetables. A day might include morning prayers at 6:00, grammar lessons from 7:00–9:00, arithmetic from 9:00–11:00, lunch and rest, writing and rhetoric in the afternoon, evening prayers by 5:00. The ringing of bells punctuated each transition. Why this rigid structure? Because disciplined time was seen as a virtue, part of forming moral, obedient Christian citizens. The connection was clear. Alarm clock punctuality equals piety. Mantelpiece delay equals disorder. Book schedule equals salvation. And as students left school and entered apprenticeships or clerical work, they brought those habits with them. The factory arrives, time becomes boss. The Industrial Revolution didn't invent time discipline, it simply weaponized it. Textile mills, ironworks, and coal mines required large numbers of workers to arrive, perform, and depart on a shared schedule. For the first time in history, vast populations began living not by natural time but by mechanical time. Factory whistles replaced the church bell. The foreman's watch replaced the priest's sermon. Workers were docked wages for arriving 5 minutes late, taking breaks outside the designated hour, stopping early even if the task was complete. This was deeply unnatural to people raised in agrarian rhythms. As one 1833 worker in Manchester lamented, "The clock is my master. I rise by it, I work by it, I sleep by it, I am owned by it." The clock had become a manager. Time clocks and surveillance. By the late 19th century, factories and offices adopted a new invention, the time clock, a device that required workers to punch in and punch out, creating a precise record of their hours. This was revolutionary. It no longer mattered if work was complete. What mattered was how many minutes were spent. Workers became measurable units, their value counted in hours, not just output. And employers began to demand efficiency in new ways. How many seconds to tie a knot? How long for a lunch break? Could someone be replaced by a faster person? A new form of anxiety was born: temporal guilt, the constant feeling of falling behind. Resistance, satire, and silent protest. Not everyone submitted to the tyranny of the clock quietly. In Germany, France, and Britain, labor unions began publishing pamphlets warning of clock slavery. Poets and radicals mocked the tick march of capitalism. Some workers played games with time, deliberately arriving just seconds after the hour, setting their personal watches slightly fast or slow, taking illicit minutes, short breaks unrecorded but cherished. In rural areas, communities resisted by continuing to live on sun time, ignoring town clocks altogether. One English town reportedly moved its church clock back 10 minutes each spring to give workers a bit more light before toil. It was never officially acknowledged, but it was understood. The pocket watch, time becomes personal. During the 18th and 19th centuries, as the cost of manufacturing fell, pocket watches became affordable to the middle class and even to skilled workers. Suddenly, timekeeping wasn't just institutional. It was individual. Men carried watches on chains. Women wore small timepieces as pendants or brooches. Children received watches as graduation or confirmation gifts. This personalization of time had complex effects. It offered freedom: workers could now self-schedule more flexibly. But also pressure: everyone now knew when you were late. It encouraged competition: arriving on time became a mark of reliability and worth. By the late 1800s, being on the dot was no longer just good manners. It was moral, standardizing time itself. As more trains crisscrossed Europe, a new problem emerged. Every town had its own time. A train might depart Paris at Paris noon, pass through Dijon at Dijon 12:12, and arrive in Lyon at Lyon 12:48. Schedules were confusing and dangerous. So railway companies began to demand standardized time zones. In 1884, at the International Meridian Conference, Greenwich, England, was selected as the prime meridian. Europe gradually divided into standardized time zones. Local noon vanished. In its place, railway time. This transition was met with confusion and some outrage. As one Polish farmer protested, "If my shadow says it is noon, I will not eat by London's clock." But trains didn't wait for shadows. The clock's hidden legacy. By 1900, clocks were embedded in every aspect of European life. Factories, schools, hospitals, army drills, banks, churches. A person might hear dozens of chimes a day, each demanding their attention. The strange part, most of them complied. The clock didn't conquer through violence or wealth. It conquered through repetition, through institutional momentum, through quiet, ticked insistence. It replaced the sun, the priest, the bell, even the body's own sense of hunger or rest. But in this new world of regulated hours, did people gain freedom or lose something older, wilder, and less measurable? The mechanical clock never needed an army. It didn't arrive with a flag or fanfare. No trumpet announced its rule. And yet, by the 20th century, it governed nearly every aspect of daily life, not with authority, but with assumption. This final section explores how that silent governance spread and what it left behind. We'll trace the legacy of clock time in the modern world, how it shaped capitalism, psychology, warfare, and even our perception of self. The once boring act of marking the hour became one of the most profound revolutions in human organization. You're not just living in a modern society, you're living in a clocked society. The watch on the wrist. World War I did more than redraw maps, it redefined time. Before the war, pocket watches were the norm, formal, delicate, often ornate. But in the trenches, soldiers couldn't fumble in their coats to check the time under fire. Timing attacks, coordinating artillery barrages, and synchronizing movements demanded speed and precision. So soldiers began strapping watches to their wrists. At first ridiculed as effeminate, wristwatches had been marketed mainly to women. They soon became essential military gear. By 1918, the wristwatch had become a symbol of modern masculinity, efficiency, and control. And once the war ended, they followed men home into offices, factories, and boardrooms. The wristwatch had evolved from jewelry into a cultural instrument, a badge of punctuality, professionalism, and discipline. The factory of the self. With standardized time in place and watches now widely worn, a new cultural phenomenon emerged, the internalization of the clock. By the mid-20th century, people didn't just obey external schedules, they began to regulate themselves. Waking with alarms, not sunlight. Eating on breaks, not hunger. Scheduling leisure, not simply stumbling into it. Time was no longer something imposed, it was something embedded. Psychologists and sociologists began to speak of the clock within. People described feeling off schedule or out of sync, as though they were malfunctioning machines. In workplaces, this new form of discipline was celebrated. The ideal worker wasn't just skilled, they were on time always. But the cost was rarely discussed. Chronophobia, fear of the tick. As time became rigid, the fear of time also grew. In 1962, philosopher Harold Rosenberg coined the term chronophobia, the fear of time slipping away, of being dominated by the clock. This wasn't the same as death anxiety, it was more subtle. The dread of wasting time, the guilt of unproductivity, the panic of deadlines, the sense of life as a to-do list. Time was now a resource finite, measurable, always depleting. Where once people lived in seasonal cycles, modern humans began to see their lives as timelines. A straight line, one direction, no returns. The ticking clock became not a guide, but a metronome of mortality. The global clock. The 20th century brought more than time discipline. It brought time synchronization not just across a country, but across the planet. Telegraphs, radios, and finally, the internet allowed the coordination of air travel, global finance, diplomacy, television broadcasting, military operations. Today, Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, governs everything from satellite launches to online banking. Leap seconds are added periodically to keep atomic clocks in sync with Earth's wobble. You can sit in Singapore and schedule a call with someone in Sao Paulo. The margin for error, seconds. But the more synchronized we became, the more we began to live in the tyranny of simultaneity of everything, everywhere, always on. The revenge of the clockless. And yet, as the 21st century progresses, a quiet backlash is building. In wellness culture, minimalist trends, and even tech criticism, we find growing resistance to time rigidity. Digital detoxes from calendars and notifications. Movements advocating slow living. Workplaces experimenting with flex time or asynchronous schedules. Mindfulness practices that explicitly ask you to ignore the clock and focus on presence. Some schools in Scandinavian countries, for example, have removed visible clocks from classrooms to reduce test anxiety. Some companies now offer meeting-free days, giving workers control over their own time. And in rural corners of the world, off-grid cabins, fishing villages, highland shepherd communities, the sun and seasons still set the rhythm. The clock is powerful, but not omnipotent. What we lost and what remains. Time discipline gave humanity many things: productivity, scientific advancement, reliable coordination, global synchronization. But it also distanced us from certain realities: the natural ebb and flow of life, the wisdom of waiting, the sacred slowness of some tasks, the art of doing one thing at a time. Monks once rang bells to pray 7 times a day. Now we check our watches 70 times a day, but rarely to pray. Has the tool outgrown its purpose? Or are we just beginning to learn how to live with it wisely? Final chimes, a reflection. We began this story in a world without ticking, a world where time was felt, not counted, where the day unfolded rather than being scheduled. And we end in a world where the second, once irrelevant, now rules. But there is a strange comfort in knowing this. The revolution of timekeeping did not arrive through conquest. It came through craft, through silent gears, through the quiet minds of clockmakers, tuning their instruments not to dominate but to understand. And so we live by hours, minutes, seconds, not because we chose them, but because they chose us over centuries.